Good evening, church. My name is Jennifer Batiste. You know, I tend to find it difficult talking about my calling and what it is that I do. While feelings of thanksgiving for God's love, grace, and mercy in my life are prevalent, I have to admit words like contradiction, paradox, and irony come to mind when I think about how I got here today. But most of all, I want you to know that the story that I'm about to share with you is a story about love. I am of the people who have been brutally colonized and brutally missionized. I am Native and I am Christian. I'm a Native licensed local pastor and a missionary working among Native people who have withstood genocide, constant attempted destruction of mind, body, and soul from church and from government. But you see, I loved going to church as a child. The church I grew up in was a very small, rural, Native American United Methodist church consisting of about 30 or 40 people, most of whom were my family members way out in the woods. The services were held in the Choctaw language. They had Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday evening services, and every fifth Sunday they had a huge all-day service singing and eating. I did not speak Choctaw, so I didn't understand what they were saying to me, but I learned what church was by watching them. I learned what church was by seeing how they treated me, how they treated each other, and I grew up thinking church was community. When I was still a little girl, I wanted to be a missionary when I grew up. In my child's mind, a missionary was simply someone who worked with the church. When I got older and I learned about what some missionaries did, what the church and what the government did to my people, I was embarrassed about my childish ambition. The church I grew up in was a small rural church in southeast Oklahoma. The church that supported and nurtured me was the same place that I learned that Native culture was wrong. It was never said outright, but I knew other than the language that everything else was not of God. Missionaries taught us that. It was taught to the Choctaws probably before they left Mississippi. And what was taught so long ago is still being lived out in some of our Native churches in 2009. I was in college in undergrad when I felt God began to woo me. I said no. But God wore me down by letting me see faces of Native people, faces that were full of despair, of desperation, of hurt, and emptiness. I asked God what was wrong with those people whose faces I was seeing, and God replied, "They've lost their hope." God didn't say what God wanted me to do, but I've always known what God was calling me to do. My argument was that I reminded God that I tended to say the wrong things, and I had a gift of making people very uncomfortable in the church. And my last argument I gave to God was, why would anybody listen to me anyway? And God did not respond, and I was left to wrestle these questions with myself. I wrestled, but I couldn't get those faces out of my head. And I thought, if God thought there was something that I could do to help ease their suffering, why wouldn't I do it? And I went back to God and said, if you tell me what to do, if you show me where to go and tell me what to say, I'll do it. I began my training as a summer intern with the General Board of Global Ministries, and I moved on to be a US2. When I was commissioned as a US2 missionary, when I got my anchor cross, which is a symbol for United Methodist missionaries, it was one of the finer moments of my life, because despite my embarrassment, my childish ambition had still been there. But it wasn't until seminary that I truly got mad. Sitting in church history, I listened to stories of the removal, stories of slavery, and the church's role in all of it, and I was mad. And I was sick listening to the stories of my beloved church's bloody history. I had read a story of a Jewish man who was so angry at God And he said, even God cannot undo the past, and I agreed with him. Even God could not undo what had been done. And I wrestled because I knew what God was calling me to do. I told God I wasn't going to go back home to Oklahoma. I wasn't going to go to the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference. As an agent of the institutional church that to this day doesn't seem to want to understand racism, won't study racism, won't even look at the history of racism in this institution, I wasn't going to go back and tell Native people to forgive when I wouldn't do it, and I wouldn't forgive the church. You know, every time I said that, I knew it couldn't be right because I could feel a stiffening, a hardness inside of me. But even God could not undo the past. While I was at Drew University, the theological school in New Jersey, I had an opportunity to go to Africa, to Ghana, for my cross-cultural credits. And we visited one of 24 slave castles that are still there. Our tour guide led us around the castle and talked about all the atrocities that happened there. When our tour was finished, he told us about the surrounding village of Elmina. He told us that the villagers who lived there didn't remember what happened in that castle. They went on and lived their lives with no memory of what had happened there. You know, my first thought on hearing this was, oh, I think I understand that. What happened there was so bad, it was so horrendous that nothing was ever going to make it right. So those people probably said, we're going to pretend to forget so nobody will even try. Now, I don't know if that's really what they thought, but as I looked at the faces of the young people from the village who were trying to sell us anything as the rest of us were walking back to our tour bus, and coming from a background of cultural collective memory, I don't think they've forgotten. I came back to the U.S., and I thought about the people of Elmina who had forgotten, and I thought about the Native people who could not forget. All of us trapped together in some sort of loop of pain and horror that generation after generation is forced to live out. Something had to be done, but I refused to forgive. After I graduated in 2006, I ended up back in Oklahoma, taking a break from my life because I still had not reconciled what God was calling me to do and what I wouldn't do. It was then that the Clinton Indian United Methodist Church came to the attention of my conference. The congregation had dwindled down to just 2 little girls, but they came every Sunday, and my conference, Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, could not bring themselves to shut it down. My mother is a Northern District superintendent, so I got a ringside seat to their efforts to find someone to take that church. For 6 months, they searched for somebody who would take that church. And I watched for 6 months before I agreed to take the little church. You know, when my conference first asked if I would take that church, I said no. But I started thinking about Martin Luther, the German monk who in 1957 wrote the 95 Theses that was regarded as a catalyst for Protestant Reformation. You know, the story goes that early, before he did all that, he was having some trouble in his spiritual life, having some trouble in his faith, and he went to his mentor to tell him this, and his mentor immediately signed him up to teach Bible at a college. And it helped Martin Luther in the end. And so I thought of that story, and I thought, well, it helped in Luther's case. Maybe it'll help in mine. That, and I figured that the 2 little girls weren't going to expect me to preach. I was probably just going to color with them. So I said yes.